Hi everyone. The second part of this week's session is Program Models for English Language Learners. Before we get started, let's go over the objectives. So hopefully after today's session, you'll be able to determine the sort of some different aspects of program models for English language learners. And some of these different aspects include the target population, the linguistic goals of the program, the language use policy in terms of the language that the teacher is going to speak versus the students, also the structure of the program and how effective it is for ELLs. So the essential components of all programs are that students learn English and also they learn academic content. Effective programs also support students' first language development as well as students' multicultural competencies. So some of the features that differ between programs include sort of some of the following that is listed on the PowerPoint, right? The target population, the linguistic goals of the program, the languages of instruction, and also the structure and the effectiveness of the program. One major problem that we face in the field of language education is sort of an inconsistency in how programs for ELLs are labeled, both in the literature and in practice. So it can come across as pretty confusing because the labels sort of shift and seem similar at times, or sometimes some programs are misnamed. So they'll be named a particular way, like a two-way immersion, but in fact will be representative of something of the program that's actually very different. So in order to really understand a program model for ELLs, instead of learning the labels and referring to the programs by their labels, what we're going to do is we're going to use the following guiding questions to clarify the differences between the programs that are available for ELLs. So again, those are the questions that are listed there on the PowerPoint, and that's the way that we're going to be able to differentiate different program options for ELLs. And actually, I also want to point out to you that by delineating programs in this way, it also helps us to determine which are the most effective programs for ELLs according to one's goals, and also which are the most appropriate programs for a particular school or community. Because as we know, communities can be different around the country. I also wanted to call your attention to the power of labels. So you can see that in the PowerPoint there's a picture of a Hispanic girl who can speak Spanish and English. And I'm using her as a representation of Hispanic children who are proficient in Spanish and English to different degrees, but who have had exposure to both languages. So depending on the program that one would put this child in, her different language abilities would either be highlighted or discouraged. So for example, a bilingual program would pay attention to her abilities in both English and Spanish. And so they would label her a bilingual child because she has the capability to learn both languages, especially that during her day she's exposed to each language at different times. An ESL instruction program is going to classify this child as an English language learner. And so by doing that, by using that label, English language learner, they are going to minimize her capabilities in Spanish and focus instead on how proficient she is in English. So you can see how negative the label limited English proficient, which is sometimes used for ELLs, is, right? Because the focus there is on how limited their English is rather than their sort of wonderful capabilities with different languages. So I'm making this point because what really made me understand the difference in how we think about bilingual children is really very much about the label, right? How we define our students and how we characterize our students really defines how we see their linguistic capabilities and potential. And that would go for academic potential as well. So this is an important concept given that the type of students that we will be talking about really fall into this category. They're students that have varying proficiencies in their first language and in English, but they also have exposure to English, and they have the potential to become proficient in either their first language and English, or if the school system doesn't support their efforts in their first language, they're going to become proficient in English alone, which is sort of a pity because then you're taking more of a subtractive approach, right? Where the child comes in with the capability for 2 or more languages. The school system, in the process of educating the child, takes away one of the languages. And again, that really depends on the linguistic goals and the language use policy of the program that these children are enrolled in, which is why so many people in the TESOL field and in the language field in general are very, very much pro-bilingual education, because it makes sense given the population that we have in the United States, especially in South Florida. So as we begin to define the different program models for English language learners, we can think about it as representing sort of a continuum, okay? And you can see this continuum represented right here, going from all the way from enrichment models to maintenance, transitional, and then to ESL and submersion models, okay? So the first 3 on the left-hand side of the continuum, enrichment, maintenance, and transitional models, are bilingual models, okay? These include in the program the use of the first language to different degrees, okay? ESL instruction is focused on English, right? Doesn't include at all the first language of the English language learner. And the submersion model we're going to learn about actually isn't a model that is legal, right? It represents the sink or swim approach, which I've talked to you about before. But unfortunately, it does actually exist in practice in some schools today that do not really provide the right resources or personnel to support ELLs. So you can see again here, these on the left-hand side are the bilingual programs where there are 2 languages used in the instruction, whereas these 2 represent English medium programs where it's solely the use of English in teaching the academic content that you would learn between K through 12. And then lastly, the ESL, the English as a second language instruction that takes place in this particular program right here. There's several different types where you're learning English as an actual subject, or you are learning English through being taught about academic content in English, like taking a class in science where the teacher is using English to teach science, and that is the way that you actually learn the language as well as the content. And then providing other types of first language support here and there, right? But nothing that would mean that the first language is systematically integrated into the curriculum. So let's start with a program, the bilingual programs, right? This area right here is where we're going to focus on first. Enrichment models, so some of the names, again, we're not going to be focusing on names, but just so that you have a reference, sort of what they might be called out there in reality. Enrichment models are sometimes called two-way immersion or dual language programs. Maintenance models are sometimes called late exit or developmental programs. And transitional models are called early exit or transitional bilingual education. And we're going to be talking about each of these and the goals, the target population, and the subject matter. Okay, so let's start with the enrichment models. So the enrichment models, the goal here is for bilingualism. In English, obviously being one of the languages, right? Every bilingual education program in the United States has to include English as one of the core languages. The goals are also academic achievement, meaning that they want students to be able to do academic work in both English and that other language. And they're going to teach the target culture along with the language that they're teaching. So if they're teaching Spanish, they're going to choose either, a target culture, maybe Mexico or Spain. And that would be reflected usually in the textbooks that are chosen for the curriculum as well, right? So those cultural aspects, for example, the national days that are celebrated, some of the history, all of those cultural pieces are going to be included in the goals of the program as well. So the target population here, there are actually two types, and it'll make sense to you if you think about enrichment. Okay, so half of the population of this program is going to be non-native English speakers or native speakers of that target language that they're teaching beyond English. Okay, so let's say Spanish, for example. If we're thinking about a Spanish-English dual language program, half of the population of students in this program are going to be Spanish native speakers, and the other half are going to be native English speakers. Okay, and so you can see that this model is called an enrichment model because both populations are still learning either English or Spanish, and so both groups, they come in monolingual and are enriched to become bilingual at the end of the program. And then the other point is that these students learn literacy skills in both languages, and also are going to be serving as models to each other of Spanish or of English. Okay, so interaction is very important in this program, where these students that represent different languages interact with each other and support each other in that learning. The other point to make is that when these students are being instructed in Spanish or in English, it's going to be in a sheltered way, meaning that the teacher who's going to be teaching English is always going to be using or ensuring that the way that she is teaching or he is teaching is going to be comprehensible, and using all of those instructional techniques that allow students who are new to that language to sort of catch on as they go. Okay, next we're going to get into maintenance models. You'll see that the goals of this program are the same: bilingualism, academic achievement, and then appreciation of the two languages that are being focused on and the cultures that are tied to those languages. Here the target population changes now. You can see that there's non-native English speakers. So all of the students would be coming in with a native language other than English and being are going to be learning English together, sort of as a non-native speaker. The subject matter, again, academic literacy, is highlighted in the first language and the second language. And here, what is different about this program is that the enrichment model was working to make two populations of students who spoke different languages bilingual, whereas this program is looking for a base of students who come in with the same language background and who are going to be learning English, and that way they're going to be teaching Spanish. Let's say if it's a Spanish-English program, they're going to continue to be teaching Spanish because we know that that helps students in learning that second language. And then when the teachers are teaching English, they're going to do it again in a sheltered way. Usually what happens is these programs begin in kindergarten and usually end around 5th or 6th grade. And mostly these models are structured such that in kindergarten, 90% of the day would be taught in Spanish, which would be the language that these children or students would know at that point, right? That's the language that they come speaking with. And 10% of the day would be in English. And then as they go up in the grade levels, so like 1st grade, 2nd grade, the ratio of English to Spanish sort of becomes a little bit more equal. So in 1st grade, it would be 80% Spanish, 20% English, right? All the way up until 5th and 6th grade, where we're getting 50%, right? So we get 50% of the days in Spanish and 50% of the days in English. And that's where the ratio stops. So the goal of the program is to get to a point where the students are being taught equally in Spanish and English and have been able to learn English through that sort of slow progression into that new language. So because of its emphasis on bilingualism and biliteracy, this program is a much stronger model for ELL students because it provides continued development of the first language. It also is helpful because many of these programs end in 5th or 6th grade, and so at that time, the students exiting from this program would have a really great foundational base in both Spanish and English, and even for academic purposes. And so this should put them in a really great place to continue learning English if they enter into an English-only program, or to pick up and begin in a new bilingual program. Okay, so let's talk about transitional models. So the transitional models the goal is different now, right? So we saw in the past enrichment and maintenance models, the goal was bilingualism and academic achievement in both languages. Here we see the goal is different. It's English language development only. Okay. Again, the target population is non-native English speakers, and the subject matter and literacy is at the beginning both languages, but the goal again is to get towards that academic literacy in English alone. And the way that this happens is sort of in a similar way, where every year that the child is in the school, and again, it's usually from kindergarten to about 5th or 6th grade, they start at a point where most of the day is taught in Spanish, but as they continue through the grades, they don't stop at a 50-50 ratio with English and Spanish. In fact, the ratio then lessens for Spanish and increases to English, so that once students get to the 5th or 6th grade or towards the end of the program, they're going to be instructed 90% of the day in English and only 10% in Spanish. Now remember, they started at a point where it was 90% in Spanish and 10% in English. And that's why this model is called transitional, because what they're trying to do is transition the English language learner from mostly being instructed in their first language, and then having more and more and more exposure to English, and then lessening the presence of Spanish at the end of the program, so that they are left with basically English. Although this type of model is obviously better than an English-only model, because at least they are getting some support in Spanish, this model is certainly not the strongest form of bilingual education program, because you are taking away the presence of the first language towards the end of the program. So what ends up happening is that these students are going to get into this sort of subtractive model where they have the potential and capability for 2 languages, but because that support is being lessened as they get older in that program, they're going to exit out with more capability in English than they would be than they would have in Spanish.